The following is paid programming. Welcome to Something More with Chris Boyd, certified financial planner practitioner and founder of Asset Management Resources, LLC, a registered investment advisor firm. We call it Something More because we like to talk not only about those important dollar and cents issues, but also the quality of life issues that make the money matters matter. Here he is, your fulfillment facilitator, your partner in prosperity, advising clients across the country, your host, J. Christopher Boyd.
Welcome to Something More with Chris Boyd. Thanks for being with us. Our show is a financial show, as you know, but we like to talk about those something more topics as well. And to do that, one of the things that I think is increasingly on everyone's mind are foreign policy issues and how they factor into our, not only our investing, but just in terms of our concerns about supply chains, security, just what's the future. And so to help us do that, I'm joined again by Jeff Perry, our co-host here. Thanks for being with me, Jeff.
Happy to be here. Looking forward to our conversation.
Same. And we are both advisory representatives with Asset Management Resources, but we're joined by our guest today, Attorney Andrew Singer. Thanks for being with us, Andrew.
Thank you for having me today.
And maybe we can start off by having Jeff jump in. You guys are longtime acquaintances and friends, right? You guys.
We are. Lisa, my wife Lisa, was hired by Andrew's father. Actually, I think she was interviewed by your mother, Andrew. I'm not sure, but
probably was.
I think she did the initial. Anyway, Lisa was a paralegal for Meyer Singer, and Andrew Singer came along shortly after. And this is, 15 plus years ago. Yes. And she worked there, I think, 13 some odd years before she retired, and I retired and moved to Florida. But yes, we know Andrew and his family and love them and appreciate the time Lisa had with them. And
as do we.
Thank you. Andrew, I got to ask you this initial question. I mean, people know you from either being an attorney with Singer Law in Dennisport, where you do land use and zoning law, a lot of big projects around the Cape, and you're very active in charitable boards. You've been on the board of Duffy before and many other organizations. So people may know you from those circles. But you're an attorney from Cape Cod. And in 2010, you write this book, China Sings to Me. 2018, right?
Yes,
sorry, I get the year wrong. China Sings to Me. And you do your book tour and you start writing more and more. Maybe that was happening before and I didn't know. But 2018, I was just zoned in and like, why does Andrew have this affection for China? So can you give us a little history of how this interest and attention, this focus of yours came about?
Absolutely. And actually, back in 2010, I was writing the book. It took a very long time.
Is that right?
It was 2018 when it was published.
I bet a lot changes over a period of time like that, too.
Oh, absolutely. Well, the book itself was a memoir. So that story did not necessarily change as much because it was from a prior time. But that actually jumps back in answering Jeff's question, which is I grew up on Cape Cod, but I was always interested in China.
Yeah.
And in fact, when I went to college in the 80s, I was looking for a school where I could study Chinese. And I was an Asian studies major with a concentration in Chinese. And I studied in China in 1986 and 1987. Oh. And that was what the basis of the long in the future memoir was my year in China. So I've always had an interest in a connection with China and with Asia more broadly.
Where'd you go to school?
For college, I went to Vassar College in Poughkeepsie, New York.
My son went there, yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Excellent school.
So is that how you got this experience abroad, through college?
Yes. When I went back in the 80s, not a lot of people were studying Chinese or going to China. It was still early on. And there was a professor at Vassar it came down to two colleges. And this professor at Vassar, Lian Chin, Chinese woman who I had met when I went there, and we connected. And so that's where I went to school. And part of the reason was I knew she had a connection where I was going to be able to study in China during my junior year.
Very interesting.
So that's what got me there. And then you said your son graduated there. I was just back there this June for my 35th reunion. Nice. I hadn't been back in a quarter century. So it's a beautiful campus.
It is a beautiful campus.
And so I've always had that interest in Asia and China. When I got out of college, I was actually a translator with the U.S. government for a year and a half or so. Then it was more just a personal interest in part of my life for many years until I wrote the book. It actually published. And then over the last 5 years, since 2018, is when I've really gotten back into becoming, well, not back into, I've become, in addition to being a lawyer, I'm a writer, author, and speaker about China and Chinese American topics. And that is what's led to my newsletter, which is what Jeff had noticed. I had the one that came out yesterday was on art, but the one a couple weeks ago was on the meeting between Xi Jinping and Joe Biden out in San Francisco. And that was obviously a current events topic.
Well, that might be a good tie-in, Jeff. I don't know. Is going next?
I kind of wanted to set the stage about the relationship, and we can go wherever you'd like. We can go back to the meeting they just had. But Pew did a survey recently, the research company, and they reported that 66% of Americans view China unfavorably. And 89% of those respondents said that they consider China to be either a competitor or an enemy. And so that's not when we want to talk about the China-US relationship, that's a pretty, those are pretty tough numbers to think about of where we are, at least how Americans view China or the Chinese government. I guess we'd have to parse that out too, because they're probably very separate. During your time there in your studies, can you comment on the other side of that? Meaning,
the people part.
What are the people that you would interact with think about the Americans? Think about us.
Interesting.
Yeah.
The numbers that you just quoted, and there are some similar numbers that come out of China about America at times. Our relationship as countries has been on a dramatic trajectory since the 1980s till now. And back when I first went to China in the 80s, everyone loved America. American society, American opportunity. China was still just coming out of the post-Mao years still, and was really just starting to begin its economic redevelopment.
Yeah.
And that lasted for a while, but then, as China's become more wealthier, more powerful, more integrated into the world economy, particularly since 2001 and joining the World Trade, you've seen exactly as those studies show, you see the change in perceptions between the two countries. Something Jeff said, I think, is critical, which is you have to make a distinction in my mind between the governments and the people. Governments sway the people through the media and what we say about each other. And again, this is on both sides, both China and America. Propaganda, whether it's straight out propaganda or more subtle, it's part of life. It's part of what we have. Even today, with those numbers where that high percentage of Americans do not view China favorably, and or vice versa in China, a lot of that I see as being driven by the pressures and the realities we as our own nation see from our media and our government. So I have a number of friends who are in China, or friends of my fiance who is Chinese, and American friends who live in China. And when I'm relating with them, or I'm listening to them talking about their relationships, everything at the person-to-person level, I find to be very welcoming, very friendly, very interested and intriguing, and with a desire to communicate. I'm a big proponent of communication and awareness, because that's the only way we can understand another people and another culture and help us understand ourselves. So at the person-to-person level, I think there is still a great deal of affinity between the peoples. Now, you get up, though, to the national and international levels, and I think that just totally changes among many countries, not just China and America, but we see it with China and America now. The relationships have these huge swings up and down. And so I'm not surprised by those numbers. When you look at the contact between the countries right now, someone asked me about American students studying in China just yesterday. And, go back about 10, 12 years ago, you had about 14,000 Americans studying in China, and you had somewhere over 400,000 Chinese studying in America. Come to today, or a couple of years ago, right in the middle of COVID, naturally those things are going to hit.
Yeah.
But the American numbers had dropped down to approximately less than 300 Americans studying in China a couple of years ago. But the Chinese studying in America has also dropped significantly, but it's still just under 300,000. So when you look at the balance of those numbers, it really hit me when I was thinking about it, because we can't know China and we can't really know ourselves, and we can't know how the two of us are going to interact if we don't understand and appreciate those who we're talking about. The two words, Jeff, you used in that survey, one was competitor, one was enemy.
Right.
I don't think in any stretch of the imagination that we're enemies. I think that we're clearly economic competitors. And, as you watch the two countries juggle their international actions, I mean, you could say we're political competitors. That's not necessarily a bad thing.
There do seem to be points at which we're adversaries when it comes to posturing in the South China Sea and, the concerns about trade at times, correct?
Oh, absolutely. When you look at the South China Sea and Taiwan are probably the two most prominent examples of areas where our geopolitical interests as the American government is very, very different from the Chinese geopolitical interests as the Chinese government.
Right.
And that can be very dangerous because accidents happen. There have been accidents that have happened in the past. And so I think we have to be very careful. I think it's important to try to understand that both countries, I think, want the same thing. They want respect, they want influence, they want power, and they want control.
Yeah.
The rub is that we both want it in very, very different ways.
Yeah, right. And you can't both have the same thing at all times, perhaps.
Not in the same space.
Yeah.
That comes back to, are there, and I'm not a political scientist, but when people, and I'm not arguing for spheres of influence, but we're such a connected world from the internet, from information, the ability for things to fly around the world to economies, that we need to figure out a way to find overlapped space where we can get along.
Yeah. I'm curious, we don't talk about China as a communist nation all that much, but the government, because there's so much involvement in free trade as well, right? But ownership of things is controlled to some extent by the state. Maybe just talk about how's that work, first of all. We don't necessarily think in terms of communism as a force in the world since the fall of the Soviet Union. But is this something that, we have very different outlooks on the role of the individual, and the role of government. And does that create in and of itself this underpinning of any kind of tensions in our prospective relationships?
I think it presents significant issues that we need to think about because of those differences. I don't like to look at the terms so much because we all can use terms differently. The Chinese constitution uses the word democracy, but how we look at democracy and how they look at democracy are going to be very different.
Yeah.
Similar with communism, it's the Chinese Communist Party, but the descriptions of the government is more a socialist republic. So putting the labels aside for a moment, I think the two big distinctions, or some of the big distinctions, as you note, are state involvement. A large part of the Chinese economy are what are called state-owned enterprises. And back in the Mao years, that was everything. You didn't have a private market. So the state-owned enterprises are still very, very significant, large corporate actors. But since China went down the market route of private companies back in, beginning in the 80s, most of the revenue growth, most of the job prospects, most of the economic vibrancy is from the private market in China. Now, that is a market that's not the same as the American market. Right. So the Chinese government has much more sway in how private companies act in China than American government has in America. So they have a market. They have much more straight government control and much more control of daily life over how people act. Look at the COVID lockdowns is a good example. That's how so it's very different than America. It doesn't mean one is necessarily, well, in my opinion, necessarily right or wrong. Both of our systems, I think, have good aspects and bad aspects.
It seems to me that the Chinese approach is more about the good of the many, whereas the U.S. approach is all about the rights of the individual. You know what I mean? And there's like a very divergent perspective that can and have rippling consequences in the way they think about individual rights or a lot of these issues.
Absolutely.
And wealth, in terms of how they deal with wealth.
Right. And China right now has one of the worst income disparities between the wealthy and the non-wealthy in the world. And that's part of what Xi Jinping's been trying to do for the last 4 or 5 years under the term of common prosperity, is to try to level out some of that high inequalities so that the poor have more. But in the Chinese scenario of this, where they are looking at more a social individualism as opposed to each individual person, taking from the wealthy who've gotten very, very wealthy over the market years and trying to redistribute that to those parts of societies that don't. That's very definitely a part of the Chinese system. The governmental system is much more involved, proactive, micromanaging, in society, from military, government, politics to economy to your local village. So absolutely, we have a different way of looking at the individual and a different way that we look at society.
It seems that some of this filters into the issues of why U.S. Investors are shying away to some extent from investing in China the way they have in the past, perhaps because of the lack of certainty of outcome of, they don't actually have the same level of ownership the way it works in U.S. markets.
Andrew, in the context of that question, can you also add in your thoughts about the elimination or the ceasing of the China project? I think this is all related about us knowing each other and having, as Chris said, maybe the confidence to invest there. It seems like it's a step backwards from where we want to go.
I do think that many of the activities that have happened over the last couple of years, prior to the last couple of weeks, have been very unfortunate, and I do think they are steps back. As far as the economy part of the question, this was I think it was last year's numbers just came out recently. It was the first time since I guess they've been counting since the 90s that foreign direct investment in China has decreased year on year. So you're right. Many people, many companies have been taking money out of China. Now there's a debate whether this is because they are concerned about the future, taking profits, redistributing their assets to some other countries to quote unquote de-risk, probably part of all of it.
Yeah.
So that is there.
Some of those supply chain issues that people focused on to not be so concentrated, that kind of thing.
I think supply chain issues is a big part of it. Vietnam and some other countries have had a lot of increased production, not just by American companies or foreign companies, but by Chinese companies. A lot of Chinese companies have moved some of their production out of China so that they can try to avoid any issues that come from the whole geopolitical tussle. But China's economy, it's having issues now, clearly. But China's also, while the foreign direct investment might be down, the issues with American investment have these questions, Chris, that you were raising. If you look at China's involvement economically with the global South and their expansion in South America and in Africa and many other places, and including even with the issues they're having with Europe, European trade is pretty vibrant between China and Europe right now. that gets back to that whole, we're all connected in some way. This world that we live in now, it's not just America. You could lose America, and there's other countries that China is and can have economic relationships with, and they are. And Chinese investment in Southeast Asia and other places, building, ports and railroads and others. And there's a lot of controversy sometimes over whether that's good or bad, but it's definitely, at least for certain groups, being a productive enterprise. And it also helps support the Chinese economy. Similarly, the US, those people who are taking, US companies that are taking money out of the country, they're redistributing it somewhere. So it's still being used for economics. The second part that Jeff asked about was the China project. The China project, which was formerly known as SupChina, is a media company. I can't remember the exact tagline, but it was something to the effect of, we report the news from both sides without prejudice or bias. So they tried to give both sides of the situation. And they give conferences, they have newsletters, many things. And I participated in these over the last several years. They closed 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago. It was a very, to us in the public not being involved, it was a very abrupt closure. And when I've read about that closure since and looked about some of the history, some of what led up to it, what ultimately led up to it was they ran out of money. They didn't have enough money to pay off, what they wanted to do. So that was just a very economic situation. But why did they run out of money when they had done a crowdfunding, what I think was pretty successful crowdfunding program last year, or a few years ago, is they were being attacked. And I wrote about this in my newsletter. They were being attacked by certain parts of the American government and society as China stooges. At the same time, they were banned in China because they were seen as being too friendly to the Western viewpoint. As I wrote in my newsletter, if you're upsetting both sides, you're probably doing something well or right. But that was a situation, really, unfortunately, where they were putting out some great productions on news and information and programs. And hey, it could be criticized. We can criticize everything on a item by item basis. But the China project folded because of really geopolitical pressures. People were suing them. People were, they were being slammed into both medias as being not doing something appropriate. What really concerns me about that, and it gets right back to something I said at the beginning, is we need to have communication and information exchange and understanding. And if we get too set in our ways, one way or the other, nations or within nations, we're going to lose that ability to learn about each other. And if we don't know each other, how can we have a relationship if I don't know who you are?
Yeah. Well, I'll say, we're running low on time, unfortunately. So I would love to have you come back and talk with us again in a month or two, just because, we didn't talk about free trade to any great extent. There's, things that people talk about, China's intended dominance and
one China policy. Sure.
And you look at, sometimes the things you were talking about with South America and the Southern Hemisphere, in Africa with some of the raw materials. Is there a game of risk happening that we're not even seeing? You know what I mean? Like that kind of thing. So I would love to have you back just to have, and also the rhetoric, the with trade wars and, there's a lot of tension from just the way we talk about China as well. So I think there's a lot of things that would be worth talking more about, and love to have you come back and share your thoughts with us if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to come back. It is a gigantic topic, as you said, and you can really scratch the surface.
Andrew, how can people, if they like what you're saying or don't like what you're saying, how can they find your newsletter? I know your book, China Sings to Me, is available on Amazon and local bookstores across the Cape, but how can people sign up or view that newsletter if they want to keep in track?
My newsletter is called Andrew Singer Talks About China. It is on Substack.com. So that's the home base of the newsletter. My website, my China website is andrewsingerchina.com. And those are both ways to get additional information and or to reach out to me with questions, or I'm always happy to have a dialogue.
All right. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you very much.
We'll talk to you again soon, I hope.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you for listening to Something More with Chris Boyd. Call us for help, whether it's financial planning, portfolio management, insurance concerns, or those quality of life issues that make the money matters matter. Whatever's on your mind, visit us at amrfinancial.com or call us toll free at 866-771-8901 or send us your questions to radio@amrfinancial.com.
You're listening to Something More with Chris Boyd, Financial Talk Show.
Asset Management Resources LLC and J. Christopher Boyd, CFP, provide investment advice on an individual basis to clients only. Proper advice depends on a complete analysis of all facts and circumstances. The information given on this program is in the nature of general financial comments and cannot be relied upon as pertaining to your specific situation. AMR LLC cannot guarantee that using the information from this show will generate profits or ensure freedom from loss. Listeners should consult their own financial advisors or conduct their own due diligence before making any financial decisions.